think there is no need for a specific introduction. We had it on Monday, but the best thing is that Searle introduced himself to the Cologne audience so well that he is getting even more audience every time he will talk. And if you expect that he stays here 2 weeks, so maybe his room will not even reach out for it. And there was this nice article in the Kölner Stadtanzeiger as well. So, what I say is, everything is prepared, for Searle, a glass of water, a blackboard and chalk, and a microphone, because Searle belongs to the walking philosophers. Doing philosophy and walking is one and the same, and not standing. So I hand you over the microphone, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I have to say I'm having a wonderful time in Cologne, but it is not entirely due to the philosophy. The beer is superb. It's just wonderful. And I'm trying to find out, how can I get a project on the philosophy of beer? But we're working on it. Okay. Now, tonight we're going to talk about one of those scandals in the history of Western philosophy, and I think it's the biggest scandal. The biggest scandal is that we have been reluctant and resistant to treating the mind in general and consciousness in particular as just an ordinary part of the physical world. And the message that I'm going to try to give you tonight is that if you think of consciousness as a biological process like digestion or photosynthesis, then most of the mysterious philosophical problems simply disappear. But it's very hard for us to think that way. And in fact, consciousness has been a kind of a scandal in our intellectual tradition, partly because we don't understand it neurobiologically. We do not have an adequate account of how neurobiological processes cause consciousness. But worse than that, people say all kinds of silly things about consciousness, and I'm just going to mention a bunch of them to start with. First of all, there are philosophers who say consciousness does not really exist. It's just an illusion. I want to pinch these guys. But in any case, that's one thing they say. Now, another thing they say is, well, if it does exist, it must really be something else. And the two favorite candidates are behaviorism. It's just behavior. And computer programs. It's just a computer program running in your brain. So those are three, I think, outrageous things that they say about consciousness. I'm going to refute or try to refute all those later. And then the fourth thing they say is, well, even if it does exist, it couldn't make any difference. I mean, if it's this sort of touchy-feely thing, how could it ever actually move bodies? And whenever somebody says that, people who say that, I want to say, just watch. I decide to raise my arm, and the damn thing goes up. And that ought to amaze us. And, philosophy, you got to allow yourself to be amazed by what any sane person regards as obvious. Not only does my arm go up, but I don't say, well, it's like the weather in Cologne. Some days she goes up, and some days she doesn't go up. No, it's up to me. I raise the damn thing anytime I like. Now, how is that possible? If consciousness is something ethereal, non-physical, touchy-feely, well, I have to answer that question. Okay, now before we really go to work, I want to offer a diagnosis for why we're in such a bad pickle about the mind in general and consciousness in particular. And I think we're the victim of two traditions that pretend to be opposed to each other, but in fact they share the same common assumption. Two traditions for discussing the mind. One is the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality that says consciousness is not a part of the physical world. And Descartes usually gets is credited as being the author of this, and his views are more strange than people realize. You see, when Descartes says animals aren't conscious, well, I want to introduce him to my He has to say that, does Descartes, because there's a sense in which we're not conscious. You see, our bodies and brains aren't conscious for Descartes. It's only the soul that is conscious. Your brain isn't conscious for Descartes. And since animals haven't got a soul, they can't be conscious. Okay, that's one tradition, and we've not fully escaped from that. Now there's another tradition that's almost as bad, that thinks it's supposed to happen. And like the tradition of God, the soul, and immortality, it says consciousness is not a part of the physical world. This tradition thinks of itself as scientific and materialist, and it says either consciousness doesn't exist at all, by some kind of illusion, or if it does exist, it's just some sort of epiphenomenon. You know, it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't matter. But both of these share the assumption that consciousness is not a part of the physical world, and that's the assumption that I'm going to challenge. Okay, so let's go to work, and we have to do what philosophy is always supposed to do. Begin by defining our terms. What is meant by consciousness? And you often hear consciousness is very hard to define. I don't think it is. I think it's rather easy to give a common sense definition. We don't have a material or a scientific definition, but at the beginning of the investigation, you need to identify what it is you're talking about. What's the target? When you talk about water, you can define water as this clear, colorless, tasteless liquid that falls out of the sky in the form of rain and flows in streams and rivers, and then later on, you figure out it's H2O. Well, with consciousness, we're not in the H2O stage yet. We're still in the clear, colorless, tasteless liquid stage. Here's the definition of consciousness. Our conscious states consist of all of those states, events, and processes of feeling, sentience, or awareness. They begin in the morning when we wake up from a dreamless sleep, and they go on again they go on all day until we fall asleep again, or die, or otherwise become unconscious. And on this account, dreams are a form of consciousness. Now that's what we're talking about. We're talking about this phenomenon of feeling or sentience or awareness. And that's the definition. But now, immediately, one feels, or a lot of people feel, but how can there be such a thing? How can there be this ethereal a set of feelings or awarenesses? How does it fit into the physical world? And I'm going to tell you very briefly, we now know quite enough about how the world works, so we can say how consciousness, so defined, is a part of the physical world. Now, those of you who study some philosophy will recognize that as the traditional mind-body problem. And again, I don't think at this level that it's a very difficult problem. It gets difficult when we get into the neurobiology, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But at this level, we can say the relationship between consciousness and the brain can be stated very simply. All of our conscious states, I'll just use states as an abbreviation for processes, events, etc. All of our conscious states are caused by lower level neurobiological processes in the brain. Presumably, the neuron plays some functional role. We're not quite sure what's the right level, but at any rate, caused by lower level neuronal processes in the brain and are themselves higher level features of the brain. So you get the stuff low down at the level of the neurons and the synapses, and that behaves in such a way that the system is conscious. There's a causal relation between the higher level feature of consciousness and the lower level behavior. But the consciousness itself is not some separate substance. It's not some juice secreted by the brain. It's just the condition that the brain is in. And these kinds of relations are very common in nature. So think of water. The water in this glass is in a liquid form. That's explained by the fact that the molecules are rolling around on each other in a more or less random fashion. If we slow them down, if we put it in the form of ice, then the system would move into crystalline structures and would no longer be liquid. Now that's a very simple causal explanation of a change in phenomenon, and I want to say that's how we ought to think of brain and consciousness as no more mysterious. My brain behaves in such a way, the neurons behave in such a way that the whole system is conscious, and then when I fall asleep, it's like the water turning into ice. The lower level behavior is such that the system is no longer conscious. But there's no great metaphysical mystery about how the brain can be conscious. A series of neuron firings produce a condition in the brain, and consciousness is a condition in the same sense in which liquidity and solidity are conditions of bodies of water. Well, okay, we've got a definition of consciousness and a solution to the mind-body problem. I mean, it looks like we're not all go home, but there are a whole lot of other things, a whole lot of other problems I need to tell you about, so here they are. What are some of the features of consciousness so defined? Well, the first feature is that it's real and irreducible. You can't get rid of it. You can't show that it's really an illusion the way the eliminativists would like to show. Why not? The idea they have is that we might discover that consciousness is an illusion in a way that we discover that rainbows and sunsets are illusions. It looks like there's an arch in the sky. It looks like the sun is setting behind the mountains, but in fact those are illusions. The actual facts are that there's a refraction of light through water vapor, and the rotation of the Earth gives us the illusion that the sun is setting behind the mountains. Now, why couldn't we similarly show that consciousness was an illusion? And this is actually a deep point. You can't make the illusion-reality distinction from consciousness, because the illusion-reality distinction depends on a distinction between how things consciously seem to us and how they really are. But where the very existence of consciousness is concerned, you can't make that distinction, because if it consciously seems to you that you are conscious, then you are conscious. That's all the fact you need. The conscious seeming is all that's necessary. Always think about it from your own point of view, because it has this mode of existence. It has this subjective or first-person mode of existence. Suppose the best neuroscientists in the world come to me and they say, Searle, we've done a serious study of you and your brain. You're not conscious. Now, do I feel, oh gosh, what terrible news. I'm really not conscious. I don't feel that for a moment. All I know is you guys made a mistake. Because these feelings that I have now, they're not evidence of consciousness, they are consciousness. If it consciously seems to me that I'm conscious, then I am conscious. Okay, so that's the first point. You can't get rid of it. Now, the second point is that, as I said in the definition, that for every conscious state, there is a certain qualitative character to the state. It's different to drink water than it is to listen to music or work on your income tax. In fact, the variety of conscious states is absolutely prodigious. I have friends who tell me they suffer the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism. I don't have that problem. I got a lot of problems, but suffering the angst of post-industrial man under late capitalism is not one of them. Now, they think that proves that I'm somehow inadequate in my sensibility, but I give them. They can have any damn conscious state they like, and consciousness comes to us in this incredible variety. Okay, so the first feature is it's real and irreducible. The second feature is there's always some qualitative character in any conscious state, but that leads to a third feature, which I mentioned on the first lecture I gave here, namely, consciousness has ontological subjectivity. I'm sorry to use the fancy words, but what that means is, remember, I made a subjective-objective distinction, and you have to distinguish between the ontological sense of the subjective-objective from the epistemic sense. That is, the mode of existence of consciousness is subjective, and it is important to emphasize that the fact that something has a subjective mode of existence does not prevent you from having an epistemically objective science of that domain. There used to be a bad syllogism that I heard from a neurobiologist that would go as follows. Science is objective, consciousness is subjective, so you cannot have a science of consciousness. That's a bad argument, because subjectivity and objectivity have two different meanings. They have an epistemic meaning, where it's types of claims that can be settled as a matter of objective fact, and then there's a mode of existence. And the bottom line of this part of the discussion is there's nothing in the ontological subjectivity of conscious states that prevents us from having an epistemically objective science of consciousness. In fact, it's a little bit silly to say that you can't have a science of consciousness. If you go to any university bookstore, go to the medical section, and look at the section on neurology, these doctors deal with patients that have actual pains. And then nobody says, well, you can't really study pain because it's subjective. No, you have to try to get an epistemically objective account in order that you can get an adequate medical treatment for these unfortunate people. So the ontological subjectivity of consciousness is one of the big sources of confusion because it leads people to think, well, you can't really have a hard science of consciousness. And what I'm saying is you can. All right. Now the next feature of consciousness, and this is one that is crucial for understanding its enormous power, is all our conscious states come to us as part of a single, unified conscious field. So I don't just hear the sound of my voice and taste the water and feel the weight of my body against the floor and see the people in the audience, but I have all of those as part of a single, unified conscious field, and that is the source of the enormous power you get from consciousness. You don't just, it's wrong, it's inadequate to think, well, it's just a matter of information processing. The notion of information and representation is much too weak to capture the enormous power that you get from immediate presentation, not just a representation, but immediate presentation of your entire environment, as well as an awareness of the immediate future and past. So you can coordinate all of this enormous amount of data that you're getting, and you can coordinate it with what has recently happened to you in the past and what you want to do in the future. That's an enormously powerful mechanism, and is, I think, one of the sources the main source of the enormous evolutionary advantage that we get from having consciousness. It's interesting to look at the history of robotics. Why have robotics been such a disappointment? You see, in the latter decades of the 20th century, commencement speakers would often say things like, by the end of the century, we will all have household robots that will take care of the family, amuse us with light conversation, tell us jokes, and do all the housework. I know this happened because the chancellor of my university used to give these speeches. But along about 1990, he stopped giving the same lesson because it was getting too close. Now, why has robotics proved to be such a disappointment? Well, I think actually the main reason is nobody knows how to make a conscious robot. You see, if you're just talking about information processing, you're just talking about the amount of data that you can handle in the space of a microsecond, then we now have computational machinery that's vastly more powerful than anything that we can do. But when it comes to this enormous, I don't quite know the word for it, but the presentational intentionality that comes from having all of this in a single unified conscious field, that is something quite unique to humans and animals. Indeed, this audience will recognize it. That's what Kant meant by the transcendental unity of apperception. He had this gift for catching phrases. The transcendental unity of apperception, I take it as what I'm talking about when I talk about the unity of consciousness. Okay, now a fourth feature of consciousness, which I think is crucial, and in a way it's the point of the other features that I mentioned, is intentionality. I mean, the fact that we have a capacity to form representations and presentations of the environment through perception, memory, and also intention and planning and desire and long-range planning and distant memories. All of these are forms of intentionality, and all intentionality, even conscious, even unconscious intentionality, is the sort of thing that can be potentially conscious. We understand something as an unconscious mental state only if it's the sort of thing that could be potentially conscious. Okay, but now then we get the next, I've lost track of the numbers, but anyway, the next feature of consciousness that I want to call your attention to is it functions causally. It makes a difference. That was not a joke when I said I can raise my arm anytime I feel like it. But here's the question. How can that be? If consciousness, as I said, is something irreducibly subjective, if it has this qualitative character to it, how can that actually move muscles? Here I think, at this point, the inadequacy of our traditional categories for describing reality really is manifest. It really becomes obvious that the traditional categories are hopelessly inadequate. Watch. Anything that does that, anything that moves my arm like that, has to cause certain neurobiological processes. Specifically, it has to cause the secretion of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine at the axon end plates of the motor neurons. No acetylcholine, no arm movement. Acetylcholine is one of my favorite neurotransmitters because it's the one that enables you to move around. It's the one that moves the muscles. I actually got a blackboard here. And now, here's the point. And this is a crucial point. One and the same event is my conscious intention in action to raise my arm, and it's a series of neurobiological processes that secrete acetylcholine. One and the same event. And the problem we're having is that our traditional categories make it impossible for us to say that. But this is perfectly familiar in nature. One and the same event in your car engine has a higher level process where it's an explosion in the cylinder that powers the piston, that actually moves the piston so it moves the crankshaft. That same event has a lower level of description where it consists of the oxidization of hydrocarbon molecules. How can one and the same event have this lower level down here and a higher level up here where the car engine is completely unmysterious? And what I'm saying is, it ought to be unmysterious about the brain. It's just, we have two problems. We have these traditions about the military against that says you can't treat consciousness as part of the physical world. It is a part of the physical world, and we know that to be the case whenever we move around. Okay, so those are the features of consciousness. I mean, I can go on with these features, but now let's go back and look at those what I said were mistakes, where we had all these mistaken conceptions of consciousness, and I think we can now answer each of those objections. Well, the first one I've already answered, the one that says consciousness doesn't really exist. I've answered that by saying it's the kind of thing where you can't make the reality illusion distinction for consciousness as you can with other types of phenomena, like sunsets and rainbows. If your consciousness seems to be that you're conscious, then you are conscious. But the second mistake is to think, well, if consciousness exists, it must really be something else. And the favorite here for a long time was behaviorism. It was the idea that, well, really, the only thing that exists is your behavior. What's so bizarre about that is everybody knows in their own case that that's false. I mean, having a pain is one thing. Behaving as if you have a pain is something else. I can easily behave without having a pain. And how could people have said this for so long? I mean, how could it have been so popular? And I think the answer was, as I said earlier, these two traditions. They thought, if you grant that consciousness exists in its own right, then you're in bed with Descartes. And you're back with godless soul and immortality. You're giving up on 300 years of scientific progress. And they mistakenly supposed that if you accept the results of scientific investigation, you have to end up saying, well, then consciousness as such doesn't exist, it's just behavior. I think behaviorism is pretty much dead. I hope it is in the United States, but I don't know. It keeps coming up in literature. Okay, but there was a third mistake that had a long influence for quite a long time, and may still be around, and that's computationalism. And that says, well, okay, if consciousness exists, it must really be something else. What is it? It's a computer program running in your brain. And you all remember, in the early days of cognitive science, there was an equation that was printed in textbook after textbook. It was the mind is to the brain as the program is to the hardware. Where to think of the conscious mind, that's just a computer program implemented in our brain. Now, I presented a presentation of this about 30 years ago. It was called a Chinese Room. I'm kind of bored repeating it, so I'm not going to repeat it tonight, but I'll give you a one-sentence version of it. It says, this can't be right, because you can carry out the steps in the program without having the feature that goes with having a conscious mind. I could carry out the step program for answering questions in Chinese, but it doesn't follow from that. I mean, I get the question, I look at what I'm supposed to do in the program, and then I give back answers in Chinese. I still don't understand Chinese. Why? Well, because this program is just syntactical. It consists of a set of symbol manipulations, whereas the mind has more than a syntax. It has a semantics. I think that argument is right. What I want to do tonight, but I think it's a deeper argument. Remember in my last lecture, I made a distinction between those features of the world that are observer independent, like force, mass, and gravitational attraction, and those that are observer relative, like money, property, government, cocktail parties, and summer vacations. They are what they are only relative to the attitudes that people have. But when it comes to physical forces like gravity, gravity doesn't be a damn house. That's observer independent or absolute. Okay, now what about cognition? Is that well, I'm sure they have an electrical came back. See, it's magic. What about computation? Well, there are some computations that are absolute or observer independent. I'll do one, okay? 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, the actual thought in my head, that was an actual computation. But these marks on the blackboard, they're only a computation relative to our interpretation. They're only the addition of 2 plus 2 to equal 4 relative to the fact that we know how to interpret the syntax. We know how to interpret the symbols. But here's the point. Computation cannot explain consciousness because something is computation only relative to consciousness. It's either got to be a conscious mind going through a computation, or it's got to be a gimmick, an object like this one. This one does everything, so I assume it does computations as well. And there it can be used by a conscious mind. So you cannot use computation to explain consciousness because computation only exists as a computation relative to some consciousness. You see, anything can be interpreted as a computer. I'll show you a very simple computer. When I drop this onto this thing, it just computed a function s equals 1/2 gt squared. It's a kind of one of my favorite functions because I understand it. 1/2 gt squared. And it computed that function, but that's relative to an interpretation. That just means I can use it to compute that function. So the objection I made in 1980 was that the syntax of the program is not sufficient for the semantics of mental content. That semantics is not intrinsic to syntax. This, I think, is a deeper objection, but it never had the kind of influence that the other objection did. This objection says not that the semantics isn't intrinsic to the syntax, which is true, but rather syntax is not intrinsic to physics. In order that something should be interpreted computationally, there must be some conscious mind that's doing the interpretation. Okay, so now it seems to me we've got the first part of what I wanted to do, which was to talk about how consciousness fits in with the rest of the world and how we can avoid some of the worst mistakes. There's one bad mistake, though, that I haven't discussed, and I want to say a little bit about that because this keeps cropping up in the philosophical literature as well. And that is the idea that, yes, Consciousness exists, but it can't make any difference. This view is called epiphenomenalism. And it says, well, if consciousness is really there, it can't actually move anything. And I've said the answer to that is to get rid of the traditional categories and just to see that one and the same event will have levels of description, as I'm raising my arm, where it has a reality that's part of a unified conscious field, but at the same time it has another level of description where it's a series of neurobiological processes terminating in the activation of the axons where the axons connect to the muscles. And then a whole lot of things happen, which I won't go into, but they're quite evolution is ingenious in the way that it was designed for muscle movement. Okay, so that's the end of the first part of the lecture. And now I'm going to go on to the harder, I don't know if it's harder, but another part where I talk about some of the difficulties in figuring out how this works as part of the real world. Some of the difficulties of getting an adequate neurobiological account of consciousness. Okay, I'm going to take it. Now, if I'm right so far, then it looks like, well, to go the next step with consciousness, you just get the neurobiologist to figure out about how it works in the brain. You just get people to do their research on what actually is happening in the brain. And I think that's exactly the right attitude to have. However, it turns out to be much harder than a lot of people thought it would be. Francis Crick, I used to discuss these issues with him, and he once said to me that consciousness was a much harder problem than DNA. And I had to burst out laughing because we've been worried about consciousness for 2,000 years. And DNA, well, that's a tough problem, and he did wonderful work. But consciousness is a much more difficult problem. Okay. So why is it more difficult? Why don't we just get busy and figure out how it works in the brain? Well, if you look at the history of science, there are normally 3 stages to a research project like this. First of all, you find the correlates. You find correlates of whatever it is. I'm taking a germ-related disease. You find correlates between the symptoms you're trying to explain and what other microstructure you think might produce those symptoms. I mean, think of the wonderful work of Ignaz V. Semmelweis in Vienna 100 years ago, where he figured out, where he really started the germ theory of disease when he discovered that women who gave birth to babies in hospitals were more likely to die of puerperal fever than those who stayed home. And that ought to worry doctors, and it did, and they finally figured out it had to do with the lack of hygiene in the hospitals. Okay, now they had a correlation. Now, similarly, what we want in studying consciousness is we want to find a correlation in the brain between states of consciousness and brain processes. And there was a lot of research on this, and some of it was quite ingenious. Indeed, there was even a term that became common, the NCC, the neuronal correlate of consciousness. And given imaging techniques, you could find a lot of interesting neuronal correlates. That's stage 1. Stage 2, you test to see if those correlations are causal. And specifically, if you thought you had a neuronal correlate of consciousness, you would want to know, can you shut down consciousness by shutting down the neuronal correlate? And can you turn it back on by turning on the neuronal correlate? This is a typical method for discovering causal relations. And then the third stage would be to try to get a theory. Why do these processes cause these sorts of conscious states? Okay, now we're still very much in the NCC stage, and there were quite a lot of interesting research that's gone on and still goes on. For example, one exciting area was the investigation of blind sight. It was called by Larry Weisskranz, who's an American who works in Austin. Now, Weisskranz found, and initially they only had one patient, and he got a lot of attention, I can tell you. But in any case, he got hit in the head, got run over when he was 10 years old by a car and damaged V once. And the guy was in effect blind in a certain portion of his visual field. If you ask him to focus his eye here, he can't see anything here. And then what you do is you rapidly flash an X or an O on the screen so fast that he can't shift his vision. He's focusing here, he can't shift his vision. You ask him, what did you see? And normally the subjects become irritated. They say, doctor, you know I have this terrible injury, I can't see anything. But make a guess. And the interesting thing is the guy was getting it right 95% of the time. He says, it seems like there's an X or it seems like there's an O. And he's getting it right. After the end of a week, he's right 95% of the time. They asked him, how did you do it? He said, I don't know, I couldn't see a damn thing. And okay, what's the hypothesis is that there are two pathways in the brain for vision, only one of which is conscious. And there's some further evidence from that. There were two guys in Canada, Milner and Goodale, and they said that in fact there are probably a whole bunch of pathways in the brain, some of which are conscious and some of which aren't. And it looks like if you can figure out exactly what the difference is, you would have found the neuronal correlate of consciousness. Now, other examples of the same type of research, where you try to find a specific feature that identifies a certain form of consciousness, had to do with a certain sorts of switches that the brain makes. And Gestalt switching is a wonderful example. I would draw you my favorite duck rabbit, but I didn't leave myself in the dry blackboard. But let's see if I can't produce a duck rabbit. This may be the worst duck rabbit ever drawn. Okay, it's either a duck looking that way or a rabbit looking up at the sky. So really the intellectual achievement of the evening. Here's the point. The amazing thing is this. Number one, it doesn't look at all like either a duck or a rabbit. If somebody, if you said to somebody, bring me a rabbit, and they brought something that looked like that, and I think that was really a terrible thing. Okay. But secondly, once you see it as either a duck or a rabbit, you really don't have a choice. I mean, you're going to see it as one or the other. You can't see it as both at once. I can either see it as a duck or a rabbit. But, and this is the point for this discussion, there must be a point at which the brain switches from seeing the duck to seeing the rabbit, and the stimulus is absolutely constant. There is no change whatever in the stimulus that your eyeball is receiving, but there's no question that the experience is different. Now, there must be a point in the brain where you go from having one experience to having another experience, and if you could find that point, you would find the neuronal correlate for those experiences. Everybody see that? And there's another beautiful research done in Germany by a guy, I don't know, named Logothetis. And what Logothetis did was study binocular rivalry. It turns out if you give one eyeball a set of horizontal lines like this, and you give the other eyeball a set of vertical lines like that, this subject does not typically see cross-matching. You typically see either horizontal or vertical. One side wins out over the other. This is called binocular rivalry because one eye wins out over its right or the other eye. Now, if you could find a point in the brain where the brain switches from producing horizontal lines to producing vertical lines, you would find an MCC for that experience. Now, what's interesting about these cases, and the reason they're philosophical and scientifically interesting, is that the stimulus is absolutely constant, as with the duck rabbit, but the inner experience is completely different. You all know from your own experience that you shift from one to the other. They're two different experiences. I have to say, however, I could go on with a whole lot of other experiments like this. The problem is, we didn't get from these what we wanted. We did not get an account of how the brain causes consciousness. Why not? Well, one thing you will notice is that the experiments I described were always already performed on conscious subjects. The guy with the blind sight, or the guy looking at the duck rabbit, or the guy with binocular rivalry, those subjects were already conscious. And what we want to know is, how does the brain create the consciousness in the first place that enables the guy to undergo the Gestalt switch or the binocular rivalry? Now, there are two different approaches to the study of consciousness, and I want to call your attention to the difference, because I think that the weaknesses of the accounts that I have given you derive from a failure to appreciate these differences. One approach I call the building block approach, and the idea of that is you should think of your whole conscious field as made of a whole lot of little building blocks of particular percepts that you have. So I see the red of that guy's shirt, and the brown of the floor, and the dark at the back of the auditorium. And think of my whole conscious field as made up of those building blocks. And certainly, this is like a lot of the history of science. As you go, you get an account of big things by starting with the little things. You think of these atoms of our consciousness as making up the total conscious field. But the problem with that is that the building blocks only exist as part of a pre-existing conscious field. And I want to suggest another approach, which I'll call the unified field approach, where you think of our total unified conscious field and think of perception not as creating consciousness, but as modifying the pre-existing conscious field. Now that may sound mysterious, so I want to explain it. Imagine that you wake up in the morning in a strange place, as I've been doing recently. You wake up and it's absolutely dark. I wonder where the hell am I? And it's completely dark. Now here's what's interesting. You can become totally alert, absolutely, obsessively alert, with minimal perceptual input, no perceptual input. You're lying there, maybe you feel the weight of the blankets on your body, or your body against the bed, but there's total darkness in the room. You have zero perceptual input, or near zero perceptual input. Now you get up and turn on the lights and walk around and brush your teeth. Are you creating consciousness? Well, in one sense you are, because you are producing conscious states that didn't exist before. But I want to suggest the right way to think of this is not that the perceptual apparatus creates consciousness, but it modifies the existing conscious field that your brain created when you woke up. Now, another alternative approach to the building block approach would be to say, well, let's figure out, how does the brain create the total conscious field? How does it create the conscious field which perception then modifies? The suggestion I'm making is we should think of perception as modifying the field, not as creating the field. And I'm thinking very simple metaphors, things that are like a great big green field, and when you get perceptions, you get bumps in the field, isn't it? You get all sorts of changes in the field that you didn't have before. Now that approach I call the unified field approach, and there are some people who pursue that approach, notably Wolf Singer at the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt, and Rodolfo Linas in New York at the NYU Medical Center. However, here's a problem, and now we're talking really a problem about actually conducting scientific research. Our existing research methods make it very difficult to study the total unified conscious field, because the existing research methods tend either to focus on imaging. You get images of certain what's going on in the brain, and the favorite here is that functional magnetic resonance imaging, and I must say I think it's very impressive. But you either get images of certain local events in the brain, or we do single cell recordings. You can find out what a single cell is doing. But neither of those methods have been adequate to give us, so far at least, to give us an adequate account of how the brain produces the total conscious field. So it may be some time, and we may need more richer forms of research apparatus before we can solve what I think is the most exciting problem in the sciences today. And that is, how does the brain create consciousness, and how do we modify it by having our perceptual inputs and other sorts of actions that we do. Okay, so what I try to do in this brief lecture then is attack the tradition that says consciousness is not a part of the ordinary biological world. And I want to emphasize, this is the main thing, a message I want to get across to you, is we should think of consciousness as like photosynthesis or digestion or secretion of bile or mitosis or meiosis. It's just a routine phenomenon that is produced by biological processes, and it's because we have this bizarre intellectual history that says, no, it's not a part of the normal physical world. Now, in order to do that, in order to follow the advice that I have been trying to give, we'd have to abandon the traditional categories, because the traditional categories say, look, if it's mental, it can't be physical, and if it's physical, it can't be mental. We have a dualistic tradition, and the people who reject the dualistic tradition usually come up with one side or the other. They either say, well, all reality is material, there's no such thing as mental reality, or there was a tradition that said, well, no, all reality is mental. They're called idealists, and not because they're higher ideals, but because they think the only thing that exists are ideas. And I'm trying to say both traditions are mistaken. They're commonly called dualism or monism. See, Descartes started counting and got up to 2. There are other philosophers. Habermas and Popper started counting and counted up to 3. There are 3 kinds of reality: the mental, the physical, and the social. There's the culture in all of its manifestations. These are something called trialists. They 3 people. And then there are people who start counting and only get up to 1. They're called monists. And they come in 2 flavors, either the materialist monist or the idealist monist. What I'm urging is, and especially if the counting turns your mic off. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that once we accept that consciousness is a kind of just a natural phenomenon and we ought to be studying it, then I think it will make a tremendous difference both in our conception of ourselves but also in our research. You see, for a long time, psychologists thought, well, if you try to study consciousness, that wouldn't be science. It wouldn't be a real scientific account. To have a scientific account, you've got to have something that is objectively measurable. And then we were off with the conception of the mind, where it consisted entirely of stimulus-response mechanisms. And I think that was a bankrupt tradition, but it went on for an extraordinary amount of time. It was extraordinarily influential. And I think we now have reached the point, or at least I hope we reach the point, where we're self-confident enough about our own experience, our own conscious experience, that we can begin to develop a science that recognizes the reality of these experiences. And the history of cognitive science is very revealing. I was in the early days of cognitive science in Berkeley, and cognitive science was essentially founded by cognitive psychologists, philosophers, anthropologists, linguists, and so on, who got sick of behaviorism. They just got sick of the whole thing. Let's just start a new discipline of cognitive science. Let the psychologists go on doing their stuff, but we'll have our own discipline of cognitive science. The problem was, in the early days, the only paradigm that seemed comfortable or seemed available was the computationalist paradigm. So the early days of cognitive science were the days when we were told, well, what we're really studying is the programs that are implemented in the brain. And that was very comforting to a lot of people, because you don't have to know how the brain works in order to study the programs. In fact, many of my friends in artificial intelligence are quite proud of the fact that they can't repair the computer when it breaks down. It's for plumbers and electricians. They're doing something much more intellectual. They're designing programs, but the hardware, who cares about the hardware? And that's how it is with the mind. The brain is just the hardware or the wetware. What actually matters is the programs, and any old hardware will do. I mean, any old brain will do, or any old computer will do, provided you've got the right program. Now, I hope we have overcome that. And what has happened is not that people got convinced by me. What happened is they got search tools. They got magnets. They got the functional magnetic resonance imaging and other sorts of scanning machines. So what is happening as we're sitting here, and I welcome this, is computational cognitive science is being replaced by cognitive neuroscience. And I welcome it, as I said, because I think that is how we will actually get an understanding of how the mind works. When we understand that, what we call the mind is a series of higher level features of the brain. And it's not that there is the mind and the brain as two separate entities. Rather, there are a series of brain functions, and those brain functions constitute our mental life. Thank you very much. versions, it said, this proves we don't have free will. Christoph Koch says that in his latest book. So the readiness potential proves you don't even begin your own actions consciously, they're already decided by your brain. Your consciousness just goes along for the ride. And besides, you don't have free will because the brain makes up its mind. Well, I can't say makes up its mind. The brain decides what to do. And then it goes along. Okay, now, there's a beautiful article by some people I never heard of, New Zealand. And what they discovered is that he had two variables in these experiments, and that people were obsessively watching the clock. And what determined his readiness potential was the clock. So what they did was get people to watch their clock and decide not to move. And you had the same readiness potential. So it isn't that the readiness potential was determining that you were going to move. It was the same whether you moved or didn't move. And it looks like, I mean, there'll be more experiments about this, it looks like what's actually happening is it's the clock that is the decisive factor in producing the illusion of the readiness potential. And indeed, one thing that a lot worries is that the actual figures were all over the place. They averaged it out to 200 or 300 milliseconds, but in fact it was an enormous study. And I think we'll probably have more research along this. To me, the interesting thing is this. Why was it so immensely influential? There was one experiment which was very fragile, and people drew spectacular conclusions. And I think the answer is because they wanted to discredit consciousness. Get the hell out of here with your consciousness. We'll show it doesn't really matter. And I suffered from this in the early days of cognitive science, because I would say we've got to focus on consciousness. And you always watch the graduate students, because they're busy trying to learn memorials of the discipline. They look at the ceiling, God, there he goes on again about consciousness. And it's not that consciousness, all that mysterious, touchy-feely stuff. And when I tried this at MIT, they said, oh, it's that California stuff, you know. It's consciousness is something they have in California, but we have more serious things. More serious things to worry about. Now, I hope all of that is changing. I mean, to me, I think the most interesting questions about the mind and its psychology about consciousness. Anyway, I'd like, if I had the time, I'd like to make a whole list of all of these experiments that are designed to show consciousness doesn't really matter. The readiness potential was the favorite, but the change blindness or other examples as well.
Consciousness is something that begins when we're awake, and something that disappears when we're asleep. And once I actually taught such processes or such states as lucid dreaming, where you have to also that you know at the same time.
Yeah. No, I wish I understood dreams. I don't. But lucid dreams are more fun than most. Because in the dream where you're being chased by the bear, you're just chased by the bear. But in a lucid dream, you know, what the hell, it's just a dream, I might as well go along and enjoy it. But those are, for me at least, those are very unusual. Now, in dreaming, there's a whole lot of research on sleep that's absolutely fascinating. But one of the things that fascinates me is that even when you're totally unconscious, you get some manifestations of consciousness. So, for example, when I wake up, I generally have some sense of how long I've been asleep. Whereas under general anesthetic, you don't get that. Under general anesthetic, you have no sense of how long you've been asleep. So there's apparently some kind of minimal awareness that even goes on in a dreamless sleep. I think that this is an exciting field of study, and right now, as we sit here, there are whole lots of interesting research going on sleep. It's just I'm not an expert.
What about the term subconscious? Where is it standing of dreaming?
What about the subconscious? Okay, well, Freud had, how shall I say, an ambiguous legacy. I guess you might call him old-fashioned Freudian upbringing. My mother was a medical doctor at a time when there were practically no medical doctors. She graduated from medical school in 1930. Think about what it meant to be a woman doctor in 1930. Well, at our house in Denver, there were various refugees from Vienna who had actually studied with Freud, and these were psychoanalysts. I remember one Czech psychoanalyst, Dr. Leo Tepley, and we'd all go down to the railway station. I remember once we went down to the railway station, in those days you did that, to see my father off on a business trip down at the Union Station. And I remember this Viennese doctor saying to me, I was about 5 years old, "Are you glad your father is going to hate?" What a dumb question. I had other things on my mind. Later on, I discovered that if you're really a good little boy, you should really want to have sex with your mother and murder your father. So it was an unusual, I had an unusual upbringing, and whenever I beat up my little brother, the punishment consisted in reading a chapter on sibling rivalry in a book written by a friend of my parents. I hated it, backward, two child psychologists. The Freudianism was, in a sense, it was like a belief in Santa Claus. And it wasn't until I really got in college that I started, grown-ups believe this. I had been taught to believe it as a very small child, this sibling rivalry and about all this stuff. But I discovered grown-ups actually believed it. Now I think it's the Freudian influence is declining, certainly in the United States. Freud has nothing like the influence that he had when I was a child. But we still have an interesting question about the unconscious. So I'm not going to give you a whole lecture on that, but let me just give you very briefly the conception that I have. There's a perfectly ordinary conception of the unconscious which seems to me correct and inevitable, and that is that I have a very large number of mental states that are perfectly genuine, but I don't happen to be thinking about them at any given moment. So, for example, I believe that George Washington was the first president of the United States, and I believe that even when I'm sound asleep and not thinking about it. Now, those are the notion of the unconscious. There is just the notion of something that doesn't happen to be conscious, but could become conscious. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate notion. It's what Freud called the preconscious. But then there's another notion, the Freudian notion, and that is the notion of repression. And we're busy with all these repressed impulses that we're too ashamed to admit, and they come out in dreams. So you get a sexual interpretation of your dreams. And in my own case, what I think is probably very common, I don't have to dream about steeples and lakes. You can dream about actual entities you find sexually attractive. You don't need to do it with all the symbols. And so I've never been able to appreciate the power of the symbolism in dreams. You don't need symbols. I don't know how this for other people, but I think sexy dreams are very common. I don't think that they're utterly mysterious. Okay, now there's a third notion of the unconscious, which came in more recently, and that I think is a mistake. And that's the notion that our cognitive capacities are based on a set of processes which have mental reality, but are at a level too deep to be accessed by consciousness at all. They're not the kind of thing that you could become conscious of. So when the child acquires language, it applies a set of rules, but they're not the sort of, unconsciously, but they're not the sort of rules you could become conscious of, because they would be stated as computational rules, usually in zeros and ones, or the rule like move alpha, that the child knows the Greek alphabet. No, it's just that's the linguist's way of representing. I think there is no reality to this notion of what I call the deep unconscious. It is a condition on something's being, an unconscious mental state, that it has to be the kind of thing that can become conscious. Now, you may not be able to bring it to consciousness because of our repression or forgetfulness or all kinds of other things. But our notion of a mental state is a notion of something which, if not conscious then and there, is at least the kind of thing which could become conscious in principle. And I think the mistake we made in the early days of cognitive science, and this is still going on, is we think, no, there must be this very deep unconscious, which is psychologically real, but inaccessible to consciousness. I don't think there's any psychological reality to that.
My question is, prerequisite to consciousness? Because if so, at what stage do we place the complexity that's necessary? Because we could use a sandbound argument to start taking out race and then end up with bacteria.
The question is, could you have, at least one version of the question is, could you have consciousness in a system that didn't consist of neurons? And I think we ought to hear that question. It's like the question, can you have a heart that functions like a heart but it's not made out of muscle tissue? And we know the answer to that because we know how the heart works. We can make artificial hearts. Now, if we knew how the brain produced consciousness, it seems to me in principle we might produce consciousness artificially. It's a physical process in the brain that produces consciousness. If we understood it, we ought to be able to duplicate it artificially. And this might have enormous implications for medicine. We could repair people's damaged brains by putting these mechanisms in there. We don't know how to do that. So the question is, can you have consciousness in a system that doesn't contain neurons? That seems to be a factual question. It's an open question. We don't know the answer to it because we don't know how the neurons do it. It seems to be quite possible that it's something that the neurons do that you might do artificially without having these nucleoproteins, without having neuronal structures. You're going to get a mic, yeah.
Do you have an opinion about the idea that there's a consciousness of all humankind, or even more, a consciousness of all of nature? Because some people, for example, when they meditate, they have this idea of being unified with all and everything.
Okay, the only known cases of consciousness are in humans and animals. There is always somebody who says, well, my plants are conscious. But if so, there's no good biological reason for supposing that, because they don't have anything like the mechanisms in humans and animals. But I'm sure you're aware, the extreme version of this sort of more universal conception of consciousness is panpsychism, that everything is conscious. And you'd be surprised how many people endorse panpsychism in one version or another. Dave Chalmers endorsed it at one point, and Christoph Koch and Giulio Canoni have come out with a different version of panpsychism. And I think it doesn't make any sense, and I want to tell you exactly why. Consciousness comes in unified fields. That was one of the messages of what I was trying to get across to us. The unified field. There's a point where my consciousness ends and somebody else's begins, or an area of unconsciousness begins. There's no consciousness in the air between you and me, though you have consciousness in your brain and I have consciousness in my brain. Now, if you believe in panpsychism, what's the unit of consciousness? And if you say, well, it's anything that processes information or something like that, the problem is the information is observable relative, and anything can be interpreted as processing information. So, I mean, one of Christoph Koch's favorite examples is the smartphone. It's conscious. Well, okay, if the smartphone is conscious, then why not the part of the smartphone that deals with making the maps? Or the part of the smartphone that does something else? And if each cell in my body is conscious, how does their consciousness relate to my consciousness? So the problem with panpsychism is nobody can give a coherent statement. The problem is it's worse than false, it's incoherent, because it cannot cope with that. The consciousness has to exist in a substrate that's capable of doing what neurons do, that's capable of causing consciousness, and it has to come in unified fields. This is why, incidentally, the split brain experiments are so interesting to us, is because it looks like you get a defect in the unity of consciousness. Everybody knows these horrible illnesses that people have, where they suffer terrible epilepsy, and the standard methods for treating epilepsy didn't work, so they severed the corpus callosum. That operation should never have been allowed, and it's not allowed anymore. They're not allowed to sever the whole thing, but they had 9 patients where they severed the entire corpus callosum, and the result is that the people behaved, I seem perfectly normal, but you can put them in experimental situations where they behaved as if two independent centers of consciousness. So you show something to the right side of the brain where they don't have language, and you ask them, they hold up a spoon, for example, you ask them what do you see, and there's the left side of the brain where they have language, they say, I don't see anything, and then they will reach out with their left hand, which is controlled by the right side of the brain, and grab the spoon. So it looks like you have two centers of consciousness, and they're communicating with each other only imperfectly, and I think that's probably the right way to describe those things. But even there, you have the unity of consciousness. It's just as divided into two parts. It's like when you have double vision or something like that, and you have instead of a single visual image, you have two. Okay, I'm sorry it's such a long-winded answer, but I think it's easy to talk nonsense about consciousness, and one kind of nonsense is panpsychism. Now, the kinds you mentioned are modification of that. It's, well, in addition to my consciousness and your consciousness, they're kind of a consciousness that we all have as just part of us. You see, and I think this is, it's not very righteous. This is sentimentalism, and you get a lot of that. Now, I'm sure a lot of my Buddhist friends are certainly intellectuals, but they say things about consciousness that I find very hard to take very seriously. I don't mean to be rude.
Hello? Okay. So, another question, which you could qualify nonsense, but just to have an idea, could you imagine any possibility or opportunity to have a kind of consciousness in machines in the future? Not today, but in artificial intelligence.
Okay, this is a question, and I'm going to repeat the question. Could a machine be conscious? And I think the answer to that, the question reveals the categories that I'm challenging. We are machines. If a machine is a physical system capable of performing functions, then the answer, could a machine be conscious, is obvious. Here's one. I'm a conscious machine. Now, but I'm sure what you really had in mind was how about artifacts made out of silicon or something like that. And that's really the same question this guy asked me, and the answer to that is we don't yet know enough about how this machine produces consciousness to know how to do it in another kind of machine. The important thing to remember is avoid invoking the magic. People say things like, well, it's complexity. If only I had a real complex machine. For all we know, consciousness may be quite simple. We don't know what the mechanisms are. But we do know that any machine capable of producing consciousness must duplicate the causal powers of this machine to get over the threshold from unconsciousness to consciousness. It might do it using some different chemistry, but it has to duplicate the causal powers. Let me give you an example. In order to make machines that can fly, you don't have to imitate birds by having wings that flap, but you do have to duplicate and not just simulate the causal power that the bird has to overcome the force of gravity in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, our airplanes actually use Bernoulli's principle, same as birds would. They have wings that produce a lift. They don't have to flap those wings because the forward motion, together with Bernoulli's principle, is enough to give them a lift. But you have to duplicate the causal powers of the machine to overcome the force of gravity. And I want to say any conscious machine would have to duplicate the threshold causal powers of this machine to get all the way down from unconsciousness to consciousness. Since we don't know how this one does it, we're not yet able to do it artificially. But I don't see any obstacle to having artificial consciousness. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
My question is, how do you distinguish attention from awareness? You mentioned awareness is part of consciousness.
Yeah. I said that consciousness consists of any state of feeling or sentience or awareness, and I meant those, I use those words carefully. Feelings would be things like bodily feelings. Any senses would be anything where I get from my perceptual apparatus, and awareness would be anything, anytime I'm consciously aware of anything. All of those are cases of consciousness. Now, what is special, and some of the questions are revealed, is that we have this remarkable ability to focus our attention on one thing rather than another. There are lots of people in this audience right now focusing my attention on you, so if somebody else was doing something over there, I wouldn't notice it. So the attention is not the same as awareness. Attention has to do with a focused awareness on a specific element of the conscious field. And my impression is we're starting to understand the neurobiology of attention shifting, of the focusing of attention. And that, you can figure out what's going on in the brain when you shift your attention from one thing to another. But the basic answer to your question is there's an account of consciousness that is independent of attention, and then there has to be an account of attention within the field of consciousness. And the metaphor of the searchlight, I think, is almost inevitable. That you then have to think, well, now I put the searchlight on this part of my conscious field, and now I put it on that part of the conscious field.
It's okay? Yeah. We have talked not about perception or awareness, but what I'm missing is imagination.
Intuition?
No,
imagination. Yeah, okay.
So it means not when I'm dreaming, not when I'm sleeping. Let's close our eyes.
Yeah.
So we say Vorstellungsbewusstsein. Vorstellung.
Yeah.
Not perception.
Yeah. No, I entirely agree. That, of course, one of the forms of awareness would be imaginary awareness, where you don't just have a set of representations of how things are, or a set of representations of how you would like them to be. You see, those in my notation come out as having either this direction fit or that direction fit. Either have mind fitting reality, or reality is supposed to change to fit the mind. But the wonderful thing about imagination is you can break this. So I see intentionality as having its most biologically primitive forms in the case where the organism is directly in contact with the environment. And that's with things like perception and action. And also with rather simple animal emotions like anger and fear and lust and disgust, where the animal responds immediately to the environment. Then you get representations, which are further down the road. And those would be things like beliefs and desires and hopes and fears and intentions. And then further down the road from that, you break the connection between the mind and the world and allow, so to speak, the mind to flow free. And that's imagination. And I don't think we understand how it works, but one thing we know is it is the source of an enormous number of the things that we hold most culturally valuable. Works of art, literature, music, all of those are, you listen to great piece of music, and you think, how the hell did the guy do it? And it's an inadequate answer to say, well, he had quite an imagination, but that at least is part of the answer. And as far as I know, we don't understand how the imagination works.
This kind of connects to the question earlier on by the lady in the front and also the
Yeah, okay. Hold up your hand so I can see what I'm talking about. Go ahead.
It's hello.
Okay. I forgot my binoculars.
So it's also regarding the imagination or visualization of things. And I was wondering what you think about, is this a unity when, for example, a paralyzed person imagines how to walk, even though he can't anymore, but through this imagination
not return.
Well, one of the things that your question is obviously getting at is the connection between imagination and creativity. The interesting thing is we don't have a theory of creativity and originality, and it's very hard to see how to get it, because the whole point is that it produces things that are new. And the temptation is to say, which is true, that the way to produce something new is by recombining old elements. But it seems inadequate to say, well, the thing about Mozart is he was good at recombining those old familiar notes. Or the thing about Goethe and Shakespeare is that they were good at recombining those old familiar words. That just seems hopelessly inadequate to capturing the originality of the works in question. Mozart could shuffle the notes better, as the Emperor of Austria said, too many notes, Mr. Mozart. But I don't have a theory of our creativity, but I think a theory of imagination would be essential to having a theory of creativity. How do you create originality?
Sorry to interrupt again. I wasn't very curious about creativity. I was more curious about the relation between something you imagine and something which becomes quite physical, and in terms of body mass.
Yeah.
And that's...
Okay, well, I may have misunderstood the first question. One of the interesting things is how, there's a fascinating technological problem, and that is how would you build artificial limbs for people who are paralyzed, where they could control the limb just by their thought processes. And we're actually making some progress with this. So if the guy's got a paralyzed arm, you might be able to wire up his brain in such a way that when he, I don't know how to say this, but he wills the arm movement, it triggers the movement so that it goes in. And I think I find this a very exciting area of, so to speak, technological therapeutics, where you design artifacts which would substitute for the natural mechanisms. So the thought process, which I have, which enables me to move my arm by secreting acetylcholine, you might have, for somebody with a paralyzed arm, the same thought process would raise the arm by some mechanical means that you have attached to his physiology. I think that's an exciting area of medical research.
The thought that I had earlier, and that probably pops up in this, is that a mechanical arm will always move. I think please move. But a couple of weeks ago, I was so tired and I thought my arm to open that window, but I'm so tired I don't know whether it will actually move when I give the order.
Yeah.
I didn't dare for a second to give that order, and then I thought, oh, where did it go? It did move. Maybe that's my caution.
Yeah. Well, Marx Brothers movies have a lot of scenes like this. Where, Groucho raises his arm and the window goes up, so the window goes down, and so on. And then we find that it all works up to a point. But all of this seems to me, again, we have mechanisms. I don't know how many of you are skiers or care about driving cars. But if you do, what you'll find is the ski becomes an extension of your body. So you can, so to speak, feel the snow conditions with the tips of your skis. And if you get to be really comfortable with your car, you get the illusion that the car is a kind of extension of yourself. I drive a German sports car, which is good for high quality machinery and a certain vulgarity of pretension. It suits me just fine. It's called a 911 Carrera Ford Model 903. I won't play all the crap that goes with it. But the point is, you get to a certain state of unity with the machinery where you feel like the machine is an extension of yourself. Now, I won't say that portion is conscious. I don't think it is. But I will say that there are, when I'm really feeling good at it. See, when I was a kid, I used to see all these guys driving Porsches, and I thought, well, that old guy, he doesn't know how to drive the thing. Well, that's the situation I'm in. Now I'm the old guy, and I don't know how to drive the thing. But anyway, you do have a sense of unity with the machine. And certainly I get that with skiing. With the skis, I feel the skis are really an extension of my feet. In fact, it seems like cheating that the skis are so easy to ski on. When I learned how to ski on wooden skis in the Alps, it was a big deal to make the damn thing turn. Now it's the easiest thing in the world. I mean, people accuse me of cheating, and they don't have to spend years learning how to make car permits. But anyway, once you learn it, then it becomes part of your body.
Hello. I don't really see how your theory is different from materialism.
Yeah, different from materialism. Did you say materialism?
Materialism.
Yeah.
Because we were against that dualism and monism thing, and I kind of see your theory as monism as well, because...
Yeah, okay, let me explain the difference. Standard versions of the philosophy of mind give you a choice. The choice is either you are a dualist, and then that's horrible because you're back in bed with Descartes and the soul and all of that stuff, or you are a materialist, in which case you are denying that there is any real consciousness, that there is any mental reality. And what I'm saying is, you can have the truth that the world consists of physical particles and fields of force, and you can also have that combined with the fact that we all are systems of irreducible consciousness. It's just that the consciousness in question is a biological feature of the system of cells that make up our body, in the same way that digestion is a biological feature. That's the message I'm getting across. And what I want to do is resist the old pigeonholes and say, well, come on now, are you a dualist or a materialist? Are you a monist or whatever? I want to say those categories are obsolete. See, one guy who criticized me in which he said, well, if you really think you can raise your arm by deciding to raise it, and you think if your arm is raised by physiological processes, you got too many causes. You got two sets of independent causes, the mental cause and the physical cause. That's exactly the picture I'm militating against. There's a single system. It's got a level of description where you describe it in terms of cells, and a level of description where you describe it in terms of its intentionality, and that's no more mysterious than the fact that your car engine has a level of description where you describe it in terms of molecules, and another level where you describe it in terms of the higher level components. When the car won't start, what do you tell the mechanic? You tell the mechanic, the damn thing won't start, I think we need new spark plugs. Now you could have said, well, the passage of electrons between the electrodes is insufficient to oxidize the hydrocarbon molecules to the extent that the oxidization becomes self-sustaining. Now you could have said that, it's the state you're describing the same system, it's just not, that's not the level. Now in Berkeley, actually, there's so many unemployed physicists working in gas stations, which you might actually say. But it's not that you've got two competing descriptions, rather you have two descriptions at two different levels of one and the same system. They're describing the same thing. So, and that's why I want to say, look, the way to get out of the categories is to see, of course, this is a physiological process. No acetylcholine, no ion channels, no actin filaments, and all that other stuff. And if you don't get that, you don't move your arm. But at the same time, there's the conscious act on your part. That's the message I'm trying to get across. Is forget about the categories we all have memorized in school or Sunday school or wherever it was, where you're taught, well, really, I'm a body and a soul. And, you know, it's just, I'm a body, but the body has certain mental features to it.
Thanks. So you said that consciousness is caused by the brain, but at the same time you just said that you can feel the earth in your skis.
Yeah.
The climate, you can feel the earth in your skin. So I said, it's your colleague in Berkeley, I don't know, and other people, they believe that consciousness is extended in the sense that, you know, It's the short step.
Look, the point is this. All consciousness goes on in the brain, but the brain has the capacity to get an awareness of portions of the body and extensions of the body that act on the brain. And you don't have to take fancy cases. Just walk across the room with there's shoes on, and you will manage to feel the floor, or if it's a rough surface, you'll feel a rough surface with the soles of your shoes. And that's because the stimulus goes right through. But the idea that consciousness might somehow leak out of the brain, that's just all. I think those are silly views. That consciousness can only exist in a substrate, and a substrate in question, like all biological processes, it is a substrate of cells. The point I'm making now is a point about phenomenology, and you can get so comfortable with a certain kind of piece of machinery that you have a sense of how the blackboard is just by rubbing the chalk against it. But that doesn't mean the chalk has got your consciousness in it. No, that's wrong.
Here's a question here, the yellow. How is there some other? The yellow shirt.
Yeah, this maybe a small question I think he's been slightly avoiding, because people kind of ask, what is the lowest form of consciousness? There is this neuroscientist who proposes like emotions or neuroassemblies are the smallest kind. The literally, I think he's just trying to show that information processing in the way he's showing it could maybe be the lowest form of consciousness, and that is a gradual thing. And what would be then for you the lowest?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing, we don't know how to answer this question, is how far down the phylogenetic scale does consciousness go? Now, there's no question that primates are conscious, and I think mammals are conscious. If somebody tries to tell me that my dog isn't conscious, I just feel ridiculous. I mean, I could show them to you and you would have to agree with me. Now, the grounds on which I say that he's conscious are not just his behavior, because I might build a mechanical dog with a wagged tail and jump up and down. But I can see that the behavior relates to a mechanism that's relatively similar to my own. He's got eyes, skin, ears, nose, mouth. He's got a set of mechanisms relatively like my own. But when you get down to the level of termites, are they conscious? I don't know. A termite, I have a friend who does research on termites, and he tells me they've only got 100,000 neurons. Well, I was that many on a big weekend. I mean, I don't think. I don't see how you get in the ball game with 100,000 neurons. I mean, we've got upwards of 100 billion neurons, at least when we're in good shape. But I think at this point in the development of science, it's not worth worrying. Are termites conscious? We got a theory of consciousness in ourselves and other higher animals, and we discovered that there's a certain set of processes that produce consciousness. And we found that those processes existed in termites but not in fleas. That would be a good ground for saying, okay, the flea works on tropisms, it's not conscious, and the termite is conscious. But that's kind of indirect. We're nowhere near that stage. At this point, it's not worth worrying about how low down consciousness goes, because we don't understand it in the clear-cut cases. If we understood it in the clear cases, like ourselves and monkeys and cats, then we would have a way of investigating whether or not it existed in other forms of lower animals. But right now we don't.
I have three questions left. To start from the back, go to you, and I will get the first one. Is there another one? Yeah, maybe four.
Okay, but
then I think we got. Okay.
Hello?
Yeah.
Good evening. You talked earlier before about the characteristics.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Okay, you talked about the characteristics of consciousness, right? One of those was the subjective concept of consciousness. So my question is, how the objective consciousness could be built through the subjective consciousness?
I didn't.
How the subjective consciousness be built through the objective consciousness?
Yes. Well, on my account, there's no such thing as objective consciousness in the sense that I define those words. Remember, I said objectivity and subjectivity have two senses. They have an epistemic sense where they distinguish types of claims. There's an ontological sense in which they distinguish modes of existence. And some things are ontologically subjective in that they only exist as experienced by a human or animal subject. Pains and tickles and itches and other forms of consciousness are all ontologically subjective. Now, one of the important functions of consciousness is it enables us to get at an objective reality. So I can see an objective reality of pieces of and microphones, which are ontologically objective. But I do that by having ontologically subjective perceptual experiences. But there's no such thing as objective consciousness, ontologically speaking.
So there's another argument about external consciousness, and that is this notebook example. So let's take a person who is suffering an Alzheimer's disease. This person could use a notebook for his memories exactly as healthy people would do with their brains. So why shouldn't we talk about the notebook as a part of our consciousness or as an external consciousness?
Well, okay, this is a common view in philosophy today, and I just would say common, I think it's hopelessly mistaken, hopelessly confused. The idea is this: if you define mental states in terms of their functions, so a belief or a memory is involved in a set of causal relations between inputs and other mental states and outputs, then why stop at the skin? Why isn't the notebook or the piece of paper part of your mind? Well, the answer is because the sorts of mechanisms that I was describing that produce consciousness, that cause and realize the conscious state, cannot exist in bits of paper. The bits of paper only function by acting on your mind when you look at it or write on it, but it does not itself constitute part of your mind. And you see this by saying, for example, if you do something like this, you're not literally tearing a bit off your mind. It's just a mistake of you. I just tore my mind. No, I didn't. I tore a piece of paper that I was using for notes. What? No, they don't. No, what happens is that the protein plaques damage the neurons. And you don't damage your memories by tearing bits of paper. We all use notebooks as mnemonics. We all have various devices for improving our memories, but it doesn't follow that those devices are part of the mind. And there's a proof of that. One is the devices don't become conscious, whereas your mind is conscious. I mean, your unconscious parts you can bring to consciousness.
You said that we should switch from computational neuroscience to cognitive neuroscience. So my question is the following. Yesterday you told us that, for example, death is not a basic feature of perception. And like cognitive psychologists, what they are doing is trying to see how the visual system extracts or creates death. And the solution they gave, like normally, is that they say visual system, what it's doing is computing death. And so, since you said that we should give up with computation, the question is, so what's the visual system doing? It's not computing something.
Okay, no, I love questions like this. What I said was not that we were replacing a computational cognitive science with computational neuroscience. That wasn't the claim. The claim is that we had the early days of cognitive science had a computational paradigm. And the idea was to get a theory of the mind, you get a program that will pass the Turing test. And then you have the psychologist investigate whether that program is psychological reality, and the psychologist only had one method, and that was reality. about the nature of vision. There is no psychological reality to the 2.5D image or the primal sketch. These were artifacts of the computational methodology. What I want to know is what happens when the photons hit the photoreceptor cells and they go back over the lateral nucleic nucleus, the V1. Well, they go first over the optic chiasmic, and those are really serious problems about how the machinery actually works. Now, the objection to the computational theories of vision is they didn't give us an adequate account of vision. Marr did not give us an adequate account of vision, and it's a revealing feature of this book. There's nothing about color, and it's hard to see how it could account for color perceptions in terms of zeros and ones. So I think that was a dead end. I mean, there's an enormous amount of intellectual effort went into it, and I appreciate the effort, but I think we will understand vision when we understand the processes by which the assault of the photons on the photoreceptor cells produce conscious visual experiences. And I think we're getting there because, as I said, we're moving away from a computational model of cognition to a neurobiological model of cognition. And that's much more work. You see, the beauty of the computational days is you didn't have to know how the brain works. As I told you, most of my friends who were in the AI and did a computational cognitive science, they didn't know anything about the brain, and their attitude was, why do you care about the brain? You know, it's just another hunk of junk. It's just another piece of hardware. Any hardware that can carry a program will do it. And I think that's wrong. I think that the brain is a causal mechanism, and it produces consciousness and intentionality by causal processes. And if you're going to understand that and duplicate it, you've got to understand the specific causal mechanisms. It's not enough to have it zeros and ones. The attitude I have is this: a computational simulation of cognition is like a computational simulation of digestion. Now we do those. There are computational simulations of digestion, but nobody ever says, okay, we got a perfect computational model of digestion, so run out and buy a pizza and stuff it in the computer and see if it'll digest it. It won't, of course, because it's a picture, it's a model, and that's how it was with the computational theories of cognition, where they use pictures or models of cognition, but they didn't actually create cognition.
My question is, how do you relate the capability of thinking to the effect of consciousness?
Yeah.
Is it the same, and what has ideas to consciousness?
Well, by thinking, you mean actually thinking the way I'm trying to think how to answer your question, then typically we think consciously. However, there are lots of thought processes that go on unconsciously. There's no question about that. And I don't know if there's any scientific study, but there's certainly in the anecdotal tradition. There are an awful lot of people who go to sleep at night worrying about a problem and wake up in the morning where the brain has been working on it all night and they've got a solution to the problem. Presumably, in some sense, they're thinking about that problem unconsciously. Now, there's a deeper point here that I want to avoid, and that is, for any conscious process, there are a whole lot of things going on in the brain which are straightforward neurobiological processes. Whenever I see anything, there are a whole lot of feedback mechanisms between V1 and the LGM. Those have no psychological reality at all, but they're part of the process that eventually produce conscious visual experiences. So the temptation is to think, well, okay, so you got this consciousness, and that's kind of the froth, that's kind of frosting on the cake, but there are all these unconscious mechanisms underneath, and that's where the real processes are going on. I don't think that's right. I think there are causal mechanisms that produce consciousness, but those causal mechanisms in general do not have any psychological reality. There's no psychological reality to the feedback mechanisms between V1 and the LGM. Well, that's the lateral geniculate nucleus. The visual system is wonderfully complicated. Very few of its mechanisms are psychologically real, although they're physiologically real.
So, I think, we have had already a long evening. You know, I hope you get the following impression that you are leaving today, that we have good beer, that we like philosophy, and that we like to discuss. Because that is what I think makes the Cologne place especially why we have fun in doing philosophy and having evenings like those here in Cologne and really with so many people now for 3 And I like you, I want to thank you. I'm very glad that you came and you have been and you are a fantastic Albertus